Civil disobedience, people reshaping laws. Over the course of time, many people and events helped shape the justice system into what people today know. Many of the changes were brought on by ordinary men and women who fought against unjust laws, even though this means at the time that they were breaking the laws. These people stood up for what was morally right, thus holding the government to the words of the Declaration of Independence. People to recognize Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. After the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution were supposed to guarantee equal rights for African Americans. But in the South, segregation of the races, the denial of opportunities to African American, and the disfranchisement continued to a system known as Jim Crow laws. In 1896, in a controversial decision, the United States Supreme Court in the case Plessy versus Ferguson upheld the separate but equal facilities for that race. On June 7, 1892, 30-year-old Homer Plessy was jailed for sitting in the white car of the East Louisiana Railroad. Plessy could easily pass for a white man, but under Louisiana law he was considered to be black, regardless of his light complexion, and for that reason he was required to sit in the colored car. When Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, legally segregating common carriers in 1892, a black civil rights organization decided to challenge the law in the courts. Plessy intentionally sat in the white section and identified himself as being black. He was arrested and the cause went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy's lawyer argued that the Supreme Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case and held the Louisiana segregation statute constitutional. Speaking of a seven-man majority, Justice Henry Brown wrote, "A statute which implies merely a legal distinction between the white and colored races has no tendency to destroy the legal equality of two races. The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things it would not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or the enforce social and distinguish from political equality, or a commonly of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either." Justice John Harlan saw the horrific consequences of the decision. "Our Constitution is color blind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The present decision, and may well be apprehended, will not only stimulate aggression more or less brutal and irritating upon the admission rights of the colored citizens, but will encourage the belief that it is possible many means of statute enactments to defeat the benefits purpose which the people of the United States had in view when they adopted the recent amendment of the Constitution. The Plessy decision set the example that separate facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional as long as they were equal. The separate but equal doctrine was quickly extended to cover many areas of public life, such as restaurants, theaters, restrooms, and public schools. This wasn't until 1954 that Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka would the separate but equal doctrine be struck down. During World War II, President Roosevelt outlawed discrimination in the military. As the country fought for freedom around the world, many African Americans began to wonder why they didn't deserve the same rights of freedom outside of the military. In 1954, a series of landmark cases testing segregation that were pressed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, ended at the Supreme Court ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education was which unanimously outlawed segregation of public schools. And on December 1st, 1955, the modern civil rights movement began. Rosa Parks, an African American woman, was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her act sparked a citywide boycott of the bus system by blacks that lasted more than a year. Rosa Parks stated in an interview, "I was arrested on December 1st, 1955 for refusing to stand up on the orders of the bus driver, after the white seats had been occupied in front. And of course, I was not in the front of the bus as many people have written and spoken, that I got on the bus and took the front seat, but I did not. I took a seat that was just back of where the white people were sitting. In fact, the last seat. A man was next to the window, and I took an aisle seat. And there were two women across. We went on undisturbed until about the second or third stop, when some white people boarded the bus and left one man standing. And when the driver noticed him standing, he told us to stand up, and I let him have those seats. I refused to them. He referred to them as front seats. And when the other three people, after some hesitancy, stood up, he wanted to know if I was going to stand up, and I told him I was not. And he told me he would have me arrested, and I told him he may do that, and of course he did." Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks organized a boycott which eventually led to the desegregation of the bus lines and launched protests across the South. In 1960, spontaneous sit-ins by students began a launch counter throughout the South. Martin Luther King was a Baptist preacher. He was a quick rise to the forefront of the civil rights movement. He was also a symbol of nonviolence of the world. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, and he was influenced by Gandhi. On May 4th, 1961, a group of 13 African Americans and white civil rights activists launched the Freedom Riders, a series of bus trips through the American South to protest segregation and interstate bus terminals. The Freedom Riders, who were recruited by the Congress of Racial Equality, a U.S. civil rights group, departed from Washington, D.C. and attempted to integrate facilities at bus terminals along the way in the Deep South. African American Freedom Riders tried to use whites only restrooms and lunch counters and vice versa. Boynton versus Virginia, 1960, expanded ban on segregation on interstate buses included bus stations, waiting rooms, and restaurants that served interstate travels. Even With these protests being nonviolent, the group encountered tremendous violence from white protesters along the route, but also drew international attention to their cause. Over the next few months, several hundred freedom riders engaged in similar actions. In September 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in buses and bus and train stations nationwide. And in 1963, television viewers saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans and whites march on Washington, D.C. to end racial discrimination. It was there that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous speech, I Have a Dream. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and schools, with also removing obstacles to voting. As part of the Civil Rights Act, the federal government would withhold funds from any state that did not desegregate. In 1967, John Gardner threatened to cut off $95.8 million in federal welfare funds to the state of Alabama unless it complied with the desegregation guidelines. Today, the push for civil rights continues, not only with the African American issues, but also the desegregation groups were inspired by the civil rights movement. Over the 1960s and 1970s, gays and lesbians, women, Native Americans, and people with disabilities pushed for their own presence in American society. And as this presentation has shown, there have always been laws that people have found unjust, whether it be the right to vote or to racial prejudice, and people took a stand for what they believed was right. And truth standing against what people find unjust in the origin of the United States of America. Americans have been fighting injustice since before they gained their title, and this may very well continue in the future, not just in America, but in every country on earth.